the Centre for Public Integrity podcast.
Welcome to the Centre for Public Integrity's podcast series. The Centre is considered by many to be Australia's leading democracy research institute. In these podcasts, we aim to bring listeners with us as we explore with key decision makers and policy designers just how our democracy works. I'm Michael Barker, former Federal Court Judge and a Director at the Centre. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the podcast Peter Malinauskas, Premier of South Australia, the 47th Premier, I think, Peter. Welcome.
Thanks very much for having me, Michael. I appreciate it.
Look, it's a big day. It's the 1st of July 2025, Peter. I've had my birthday. You may well have one coming up, but even more important than that, South Australia's landmark accountability and integrity amendments to the South Australian Electoral Act take effect today. Premier, you must be very proud.
Look, I am. I'm proud of the fact that we've made this sort of rather Herculean change to the way that elections in South Australia are funded. It's been a long-standing interest of mine, going right back to a particular trip I had to the United States in 2014, actually. And I promised myself back then if I was ever given the opportunity to do something about the way elections are funded, we would do it. And today, these new laws come into effect in South Australia, and it's a big deal. We're a small jurisdiction in the scheme of things, but we're a jurisdiction that's got a tradition of leading when it comes to reform to our democracy. And I hope this sort of honours that tradition and gets a bit of interest in other parts of the country that may choose to follow suit.
It's really quite interesting, isn't it? We'll perhaps talk a little bit more about what democracy means, particularly in a federation. But one of the great things about a federal system is you can sort of plant 100 flowers and see if they all bloom, sort of thing. And South Australia, as you say, is leading the way here. What are the key elements of this that mark it out from other political finance laws in Australia?
Well, we've gone, the full Monty when it comes to reform to the way the elections are funded. We have banned all political donations, full stop. Every last dollar from unions, from businesses, wealthy individuals. What we're now saying is that in the state of South Australia, the election that we have that's in March next year, it'll be an election exclusively funded through public funding. All elections are banned. And what this does is actively level the playing field between the major political parties, but also giving a big advantage to newcomers and smaller political parties who will better be able to compete. And I guess the policy objective that we have at the core of this is to ensure that elections are determined by the quality of candidates and the policy effort that is put in by those parties and political candidates, as distinct from elections being determined by the size of one's arsenal in respect to, funding to be able to prosecute a message. So removing money from politics, we think, is a virtuous thing in a number of respects, but not least of which is making sure that elections are determined by the things that people should care about most.
Have you had pushback from your colleagues interstate or federally?
I've certainly had pushback from some of my colleagues locally, because the hardest thing for the Labor Party to do, and this differs from outfit to outfit, but the hardest part of this from the Labor Party's perspective is severing that financial link between the trade union movement and the party. We've never seen that in the history of the Labor Party before, but obviously what sort of underpins this is that if you're banning business donations, you can't sort of say, look, your money is good and your money is bad. You got to have the rule. It's got to be consistent for everybody. So if we're banning donations from businesses and wealthy individuals, we've got to be willing to do it from unions as well. And that's a hard thing for some people to accept, and I understand that. But I nonetheless believe it's the right thing to do, and I guess I've been using the weight of this office to press it forward.
Well, congratulations, because one doesn't often see such a remarkable reform movement and driven by a premier in a state like South Australia. But you mentioned your visit to the United States, which steeled you to this by the sound of it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I suspect this is going to take us right into the kernel of democracy.
Yeah, I think it's well understood from people interested in political affairs that in the US, there is a pervasive presence of political donations and fundraising in the US political system. But what struck me, I was there in 2014 for the US midterms. I was there as a political excursion. There were people from all political parties on this trip that I was on. And we met with both Republican candidates, Democratic candidates, but also critically their campaign managers. And campaign managers in the US are professional. And, they're paid parade operators, and they live or die by their win-loss record. And so the idea, if you're a candidate, is you want to get a campaign manager that has a successful win-loss record. Of course, the higher the win rate, the more expensive those particular campaign managers are. And we got to meet a few of them, ones that had success rates of over 80%. And the best campaign managers, the most sought-after ones, put a requirement on their candidates that if they are going to work for them, that then they've got to sign up, the candidates have to sign up to spending at least 80% of their time fundraising. And I got to meet firsthand candidates who were going through this and campaign managers who impose those obligations on candidates. Now, just think about that for a moment, right? And they were just talking about it openly as this is a matter of course. This is standard operating procedure. But this is candidates, politicians, members of Congress saying that they spend 80% of their time fundraising. So that's not going to, town hall meetings. That's not developing policy. That's not sitting down with community advocates. That's time spent exclusively fundraising, acting like a telemarketer. And it struck me as patently absurd that we would have MPs who are less MP and more professional fundraiser. Now, when you get to a point where it is so egregious, I think it demands a response. And in an Australian context, while we're absolutely nowhere near that, what we have seen over time is a graduation of effort of members of parliament and candidates spending yet more of their time fundraising rather than doing the actual day job. And I think that, invites a policy intervention, which is what we've done here in South Australia, to cut that off at the pass before we get so extreme in a way that I think is perverse.
I suppose to the average citizen listening to this, they'll say, yeah, I get that, because when you're out there fundraising 80% of the time, you must incur, whether you realise it or not, and I imagine you do, obligations to the people that you are asking to fund.
Well, this is an interesting point. I can't speak for everyone, but I've never been witness. I'm not aware of anyone that's ever said, look, you donate me this money and I'll change my policy accordingly. That's not the way.
It's not quite like that.
No, it doesn't happen like that. That would be
it might be
corrupt.
Might be called bribery.
Yes, indeed. But what I do think is a problem, though, is if you're a member of parliament and you're spending all your time fundraising, you are disproportionately spending more time with people of the means to be able to make those donations rather than members of the general public. And I just worry about the impact that has on a person's worldview. I think if we are in positions of developing policy or making big decisions in government, you want your opinion to be informed by the lived experience of as many people as possible, rather than just being of the lived experience of those people who have the capacity or means to be able to donate to a political cause, which is a pretty esoteric and niche part of the constituency. Let's be honest about it. The majority of, the Australian people aren't sitting around contemplating, if they're going to donate money, they tend not to be political parties and rather to another cause. So, I worry about like I said, the disproportionate influence of only hearing from some people might have on the worldview of a politician, rather than a broader sense of what the rest of the community is thinking and feeling.
Peter, I've become increasingly interested in trying to understand where our concepts individually, yours in this case, about democracy have come from. Are they nurtured? Do they come from the womb? Do they come from when you were at school? Did you become sort of energised by some injustice when you were a teenager? Where did your interest in this democratic issue all come from, do you think?
Oh, look, I think everyone's story is probably a bit different. I think, in most people's cases, their views about things will sort of form iteratively over time from different influences. But if you ask me what the genesis of my, interest in democracy is more broadly, is probably from my paternal grandparents. Malinauskas is Lithuanian, and my so my grandfather was Lithuanian. He was a displaced person post-World War II, fleeing the communists. Today, you'd call him a refugee. Similarly with my grandmother, she came from Hungary. She was also fleeing the communists in 1940. They were both 48, 49 arrivals to Australia. Anyway, so they came here with nothing, and they were literally, all they wanted to do was, as young people, choose to live in a liberal democracy where they could express their view about the society they were going to live in. And they saw that the ritual of voting as a precious commodity, a precious gift, really, that our nation had provided them. And so as a young person growing up, in a way that I didn't fully appreciate at the time, they were permanently drilling into me a message of just how lucky I was to be an Australian and how lucky we were to be able to have this rich liberal democracy. I remember as a kid sitting next to my grandfather, I would have been, 10, 11 years of age, as we saw the Berlin Wall fall and even prior to that, the rise of Lech Walesa and Solidarity in Poland and these big democratic movements for change in the part of the world that he grew up in or was witness to. I remember how powerful that was for him and him trying to explain to me that, here we just get it by birth almost, and that's not something we should take for granted.
The concept of liberal democracy, of course, pervades countries in the West,
Yep.
Australia particularly. We've sort of inherited the British system of government, made it our own in many respects. Do you fear that liberal democracy, as quote unquote we knew it, is under threat?
Absolutely it is.
And why is it?
I think apathy's on the rise. I think democracy's Achilles heel is apathy. I don't think enough people who are born into a liberal democracy, as I was, I don't think enough people treat voting or being engaged in the political process, even just as a citizen, I don't think they see that as a civil responsibility or a civic duty. I think they see it as a burden that has to be sort of, adhered to. There's this US Supreme Court justice, I think, coined the phrase, his name was Felix Frankfurter, he coined the phrase, the highest office in any democracy is the office of citizen. And I think that's a truism that isn't well understood from the electorate more broadly. And as we have seen people sort of become less conscious of a sense of civic duty towards, their body politic, what we have seen is apathy take hold or a degree of unhealthy cynicism. I think there's healthy cynicism that we've got to maintain in Australia amongst the constituency. But I think what we've seen is a level of unhealthy cynicism that then translates to becoming an excuse to not care anymore. Like, the sort of phrases you hear are, they're all bastards, they're all corrupt politicians, they're all, I can think of a range of
Epithets.
Words not to use. And I worry that just becomes an excuse to say, oh, look, I'm not going to care about voting anymore because it doesn't make a difference anyway. When, of course, the opposite is true. The whole system depends upon citizens seeing their voting as a civic duty that helps that is the sort of the oil that keeps everything moving in the system. And I'm worried that isn't well understood at the moment, and we're starting to see some degradation in institutions and perceptions of the democratic process that are highly problematic.
It was brought home to me recently, harking back to the American system, that one of the reasons they have those paid fundraisers and politicians spending 80% of their time raising the funds is that voting isn't compulsory in the US, and you need to get the vote out. And a lot of that money, I understand, actually gets spent on getting the vote out. It seems strange, doesn't it? We have a compulsory system.
It is one of the great virtues of our system, compulsory voting. And yes, you're right. Much of the funds raised in US politics are sort of orientated exclusively towards getting the vote out. And that also lends itself to a more negative type of political campaigning because people are more voted to turn out to vote against something rather than vote for something, which invites more negative campaigning in a non-compulsory voting environment. Here, by at least having compulsory voting, the political apparatus and political leaders aren't thinking about getting people out to vote. They know they're going to vote, and therefore it's a case of persuading which way they vote. And that does fundamentally change the tenet and the nature of a political campaign. But it also means that fundraising becomes less necessary to achieve that end. And I think that's a good thing. I've had many discussions with Americans about the virtues, or in their case, the pitfalls of compulsory voting. They hate the idea of it, which is not surprising given their sort of understanding of liberty and government therefore not being able to impose anything upon them. But the best argument I've had, and this doesn't mean it carries the day, far from it, but the best argument I've been able to sort of conjure up is if the government can compel you to pay taxes, then it's not unreasonable for the government to compel you to have a say on how those taxes are spent. And I think it's a good thing.
We'll come back to free speech, which gets caught up in all of that. The right to speak freely, I suppose one might argue, is the right not to speak at all, not to vote. And people can argue long and hard about that. You don't have to vote either in the UK, for example.
Well, you don't have to vote here even, right?
Well,
you just have to
suffer the penalty.
No, you could turn up on the day, get your name crossed off the list, and then cast an informal ballot.
True.
And you won't be penalised. So
there are ways and means, Peter.
Indeed.
Another aspect of this, though, going back to what you're learning from your paternal grandparents and that sort of being infused into you in a sense, it's almost by osmosis, you're learning things. When I was young, and I'm a little older than you, a previous generation perhaps, there was great respect for the political process. Whether people in those days, usually just Labor and Liberal, there was respect for what job people were doing. And probably because I was that much younger, they always seemed a lot older than you are now, Peter, when they went into politics. But then in more recent times, I was one of the counsel assisting the W. Wink Royal Commission in the early 1990s. And we had professors of political science saying what's missing in all of this modern system of politics is there's no civics being taught to the kids. And I thought I knew all about civics. I'd been to law school and I'd studied constitutional law. Didn't think I needed them. I've always been cynical about civics, but what do you think about that? Some Scandinavian countries go to quite some lengths.
Well, as part of we're banning political donations is one thing, but we want to go further than that. There's other things that we're doing as well, including investing heavily in teaching civics in schools in a completely non-partisan way, which is obviously essential. So what happens at the moment in the Australian education system, the kids get a familiarity with civics in year 5 and year 6, and that's pretty basic and preliminary, as you'd expect for kids of that age. But then there's not much after that. And what we've done here in South Australia is, starting this year, in fact, is revitalising the way we teach civics for 15, 16, 17-year-olds as they approach voting age, including we're having a major democracy forum for all high school students across the state later this year in October, I think it is. And what we're really trying to do there, and I hope people appreciate what I'm trying to say, is I don't want this forum and these efforts to just focus on the kids that are school prefects, because they tend to be the kids that are more engaged anyway. I'm talking about every kid, right? Particularly children that would ordinarily might choose not to be engaged in anything to do with civics or politics. Unless you're interested, I should be clear, unless you're interested in teaching kids politics, but more just basic understanding of the institutions and their capacity to be able to inform outcomes. I think that's really important. I don't think we do enough of it, particularly given how precious we now see politics being.
So I take it from that you're not just talking about how the parliament is structured, and most places in Australia with a lower house and an upper house. I think you were originally in the upper house, weren't you?
Very briefly, yes.
Well, you'd have to tell me how that happened. But presumably about how the executive works, about some of the issues that you see played out in the media and what that all means?
Absolutely. I think it's about teaching young people to have the critical faculty to be able to form their own objective opinions consistent with their value systems, consistent with how they can, collate information, that is, and then assess it against, in terms of how accurate it is. We want to give people those skills that then informs their ability to cast a vote knowingly, aligned whatever their views might be. But also basic things around the separation of powers and the necessary, roles that different levels of government have. These are the basic things that we want them to understand. But more than anything, I just want young people to have an appreciation of how exceptionally lucky we are to have that right to be able to vote and the power of it. It's not just, this sense that voting is a powerless exercise. We know that the opposite is true, just as people understand that.
And one might throw the rule of law into that understanding.
Indeed.
Peter, the question of free speech, I alluded to it, and we all know, those of us who've been in North America and the US, just how powerful a concept that is. The idea that you might regulate political donations by saying you can't make them would be anathema.
Yes.
In the US. You probably wouldn't need to run a trial case to the American Supreme Court to find out you can't do it. But is free speech the answer to most of these contentious issues?
Well, I think freedom of speech is absolutely critical. I balk at the idea of governments regulating speech. Obviously, there is a suggestion in some quarters, and there's been many a case on this, whether or not people expending money during the course of a political campaign is an extension of freedom of speech. And that's something that we've had to sort of navigate very carefully in terms of how we construct this legislation. We're not stopping any individual or any business or charity or anybody else from running campaigns during an election. What we're banning is the practice of a member of parliament receiving donations themselves. And that's an important distinction when we think about freedom of speech. But preserving or not inhibiting freedom of speech I think is an absolute necessity. And often there are questions of how far those rights go, particularly when it comes to, extremism and people, imposing their views upon others in a way that might not be satisfactory in a sort of context of, racism, for instance. And getting that balance right is really delicate, and I think it's important.
As I understand it, whilst one doesn't expect the rise of what are called super PACs in the United States that have probably billions of dollars these days to spend on a campaign, there will be third parties who no doubt will club together and will want to campaign on particular issues, for example, at your next state election in 12.
As they should.
Yes.
So we've in a way that I didn't anticipate when we were crafting this legislation, the legislation does allow for that type of campaigning, as it should, but it also caps the expenditure. So, and we've taken advice from an expert panel about this. We're not the only state around the country that's got this arrangement in place, but if you're a union or a business or a lobby group or whoever, and you want to run a campaign during the election period, you can, but the amount that you can spend as an individual organisation is capped. And there's very strict rules about how that relates to a political party. There can't be a relationship, to be clear. So, again, this is about trying to get the balance so that everyone's rights are preserved. People are able to campaign as freely as they like and resource accordingly, but at the same time, not in such a way that actually diminishes other people to have their voice heard during the course of the democratic process, particularly people who might not have the means to spend $500,000 on a campaign.
Peter, another issue that I've been trying to think about deeply but haven't got terribly far, so my question will come across, I'm sure, to you fairly superficially, and that's the question of the relationship between democracy and party politics. I'm trying to work out in my own mind whether party politics is inimical to good democratic practice. And I'm not sure I can articulate it much more than that, but we've had this strong system of two-party politics. The coalition governments in Australia have typically been Liberal National, in the old days Country Party, and it was them and nobody else. Is there some risk that if one party holds government all the time, and you're a very popular premier here, just like Mark McGowan was in Western Australia, you can finish up with a one-party parliament?
I don't think so, because popularity comes and go in politics, and history tells us that pretty quickly. Like, you can be going okay 1 minute and dead the next. So
feather duster.
Yeah, that's right. So nothing's temporary. So nothing's permanent. Everything is temporary. I think that's unlikely. I think party politics is an essential ingredient in the operation of the Westminster system. And if you look at our history, both at a state level but also at a federal level, post-federation, we saw a high degree of instability in the operations of the parliament and the ability of executive government to govern for the nation through a lack of a party system or a well-structured one. So it took an evolution of democracy for the two-party system to evolve. And that two-party system is not embedded in any way. That's subject to change in of itself. And we've seen it being tested recently, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But what I would say is, the executive arm of government works far better when the principles of cabinet solidarity are being adhered to, and you've got a degree of unity of purpose around what you're trying to achieve. Now, as distinct from having just a hodgepodge of different individuals running their own race, that tends not to be the best way to govern. But ultimately, it's the electorate that determines this. It is the electorate. I mean, the electorate the electorate is open to elect as many independents as they like, and we've seen that on the rise, and the pressure on the system as a result. But in my view, and I would say this as the leader of a political party, but I think parties are a necessary function in order to see a degree of stability in the way that the government operates, and then that in turn will be tested at every election either 3 or 4 years later.
I'm sure you're right with respect when you say that. To give a very simple example, the state seat of Fremantle in Western Australia and the federal seat of Fremantle in Western Australia at the recent state and federal elections, respectively, suffered an awful shock. Very safe seats for Labor, and an independent candidate running for the first time, fashioning herself as a teal-coloured candidate, nearly pulled off victories. And that was, I think, a Bolshie Fremantle electorate speaking their mind.
I think the days of safe seats are coming to an end. I don't know if there is such a thing as safe seats anymore. And if you look at what happened in the seat of Fowler in the 2022 federal election, a seat that had been seen as long-held, entrenched Labor, was taken over by an independent because arguably the Labor Party didn't pre-select very well, in some people's view. So, there is no such thing as a safe seat anymore, and I think anybody who occupies a seat in Parliament and thinks their seat is safe is probably one step closer to losing, because people's allegiance to political parties is becoming less tribal and far more flexible, which is not necessarily a bad thing because it keeps MPs honest.
Probably what will happen when they've all done their civics courses at high school.
Yeah, I know, that's right.
The other phenomenon is, and the political scientists keep pointing this out to us, to me in particular, is that the primary vote for the major parties has been declining for some years now. And we've seen the rise of the Teals, and particularly when it comes to the Liberal Party in urban seats, that the Teals have done well, which raises for me an interesting question of how do parties go about pre-selecting? You've made a sort of a side-handed reference to it a minute ago. For the Labor Party, can the pre-selection process be changed and improved so it responds more to what the democratically chosen candidates who they ought to be? Does the American primary system offer anything?
Oh, look, I think it always can be improved, but I think the American primary system is deeply flawed. And the reason why I say that is because the American primary system is contributing to the polarization of politics in America, where, in safe Republican constituencies, and this also goes to independent, the way that boundaries are drawn in the US, but put that to one side for a moment. Safe Republican constituencies and safe Democratic constituencies, the big battle doesn't become the general election, it becomes the primary. And then what we start to see is primaries that sort of coalesce around who is more ideologically pure. And you see a push to the far right in Republican districts and a push to the far left in Democratic constituencies. And then that in turn leaves a whole bunch of people or voters left to one side. Now, my politics is centre-left. I think it's far more virtuous if you have a healthy political context in a general election rather than one driven by extremes in a pre-selection contest. So while I think there is always room for improvement, and I think greater participation is a source of that improvement, or can be a source of that improvement in pre-selection processes, I am not necessarily a major advocate of the primary system because of that polarization. And I don't think anybody who is observing politics globally at the moment would necessarily say that hyperpolarization is good. Contest of ideas and values, absolutely. But hyper-polarization, I think, can get to a point where it becomes unhealthy.
I like watching the AFL footballers on the ground. Sometimes they clash pretty strongly.
Yeah.
I think something terrible is going to happen on the ground. But at the end of the match, you see the same guys matching up, hugging each other, and having a yarn. Is that a good thing?
Absolutely, it is. Yeah, but I don't think we see enough of that in our politics. I think I saw a piece of footage recently of Jimmy Carter and President Ford sitting on a panel. I mean, they're obviously both deceased, and they were talking about each other on this panel discussion from years ago, and it was striking how civil they were to one another. And here is two presidents who contested an election in a pretty competitive way, only one prevailing, yet they maintain a degree of civility and friendship towards one another. Or even I saw other footage, which is even more recent again, of George W. Bush standing up in the Congress and acknowledging that he was delivering a State of the Union for the first time in American history by commencing with the words, "Madam Speaker." And behind him, or everyone stands and gives an ovation, Democrat and Republican, including Dick Cheney, who most people would have seen as being rather hawkish as far as on the conservative side of politics. That feels like it wouldn't happen today in the US Congress. My point being, I think that broadly the electorate would prefer to see a degree of civility between our political leaders, notwithstanding a intense degree of competition between them. We want footballers shaking on the hands after the game, right? So that kids who are watching the AFL Heroes know what healthy competition looks like. I think in politics, we probably could take a lesson from that.
Peter, the recent electoral reforms are obviously a great blow for democracy from your standpoint and as a premier. Are there other democracy initiatives up your sleeve that you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, look, the big one that I think there's one that is a work in progress, and there's one that I think we've got to turn our minds to is just broadly around the country. The first one is what we're doing around social media and disinformation. We led the charge in South Australia to see to this social media age limit, which I think is important for young people in particular. The federal government's implementing that later in the year. And I think we've got more work to do about how we're going to regulate AI in respect to the political process. If it's used for nefarious purposes in our democracy, that is exceptionally dangerous. Deep fakes really worries me.
You're not alone.
Really, and I've seen some outstanding deep fakes, and you cannot discern what is real and what is not real.
And a picture speaks at least 1,000.
Oh my word, absolutely. The power of images has always been exceptional in regards to politics, going right back to the first electoral posters. But the other outside of the technology, I do think lobbying, the way that lobbying operates in our body politic, is worthy of consideration.
I'm pleased you've mentioned that because I wanted to ask you distinctly about lobbying. I mean, This is what happens behind closed doors. This is the part of politics which probably the ordinary citizen out there, and they say you can't trust them, just assumes that all sorts of vested interests are in behind the closed doors, chatting to ministers and having some impact when others aren't on public policy. How do you deal with it?
It's a really tricky one to deal with, and I can't sit here and offer you a silver bullet.
Centre for Public Integrity, no doubt, will in a little.
Well, I hope they do. I hope they do, and I'm sure Catherine and her team are actively considering this. Look, I don't think it's an easy problem to solve, but I do think it's an issue that we need to address, because I think government in particular, but also opposition, that's the alternative government, I think we like the idea, and we should hold a candle to the ideal that politics is informed by getting quality outcomes for as many people as possible, rather than it being about sectional interests, having disproportionate influence. And that's where I think lobbying, we need to address it, at least the perception of it. it's not an easy problem to address because I think it's legitimate on one hand that a political leader may to make a decision for a particular industry wants to be as informed as possible, but just not disproportionately to other considerations. And that's the balance we've got to pursue. I think the first step is to get money out of politics because often we see lobbying and fundraising
hand in hand.
Happening hand in glove. Absolutely. I think by moving money, we go a long way to making a difference, but I do think this is an area that we could improve.
Well, there's the accountability side of government. There's also this simple transparency side of government. And many of us think that simply by publishing the diary commitments that a minister or a premier has that are coming up this week or this month would be helpful. If someone's meeting the chairman of BHP and there's a big issue around, it's interesting to know.
It's interesting. I mean, so my diary is I think most premiers and ministers and even maybe the Prime Minister's diary is publicly available through the FOI process. I don't know if they're proactively disclosed.
Oh, I doubt it.
Yeah, all right. Well, but I get FOI'd. My diary gets FOI'd all the time, right? There are some serial FOIs, and you go through they go through an arduous process, and eventually it gets released. I mean, this is probably not the answer that you want to hear. I think we're going to get a balance right here because if someone's coming to meet their local MP, shouldn't they be entitled to do that with a degree of privacy?
I want to talk to you about the dividing fence and they don't want the neighbour to know that they're meeting you, in a sense.
Yeah, and I've had constituents of mine coming to talk to me about issues like that pertain to domestic violence or a personal family matter, and aren't they entitled to see their MP with a degree of privacy? I think a lot of people would engage with a politician not expecting that information could end up on the front page of the paper, for instance. Now, similarly, when I meet with companies or the owners of businesses that might be facing really difficult commercial circumstances and they want to share their concern with government, should that be disclosed in full public view? These are questions that I think we have to contemplate. And like anything, I think what you want to pursue is a balance. I mean, I for one am not too fussed what people know what I'm doing. In fact, if they know what I'm doing, they're knowing, hopefully they get a sense that it's not all easy and no one's sort of sitting around and
it might be good politics. People will be less suspicious, and there's probably a distinction to be made between consultation with the MP as MP and a minister who's got the decision-making function that can result in people, in a sense, making money.
True. But of course, all members of the executive are members of parliament as well, and how you just
make the distinction.
These are challenges. Look, regardless, I don't think transparency should be something we should fear, but I think transparency for transparency's sake also sometimes can inhibit the process rather than advance it. So it's just about getting a balance here. But look, either way, like I said, I don't profit to have all the solutions, but I do think that we should be contemplating what more we can do around the lobbying effort.
Peter, we're getting towards the end of the podcast. It's really interesting, but tell our listeners a little bit more about why and how you got into politics.
How
old were you when you thought you might like to pursue this path?
Probably in my 20s it started to become on my mind. I've always had an interest in current affairs because of the influence of my parents and grandparents, but never in a party political way. They were never like join Liberal, join Labor. I think with hindsight, I can honestly say there were differing views within my family about if they had a political allegiance, which one it was. So I never grew up in a party or in a partisan context, but I think when I was at university and I was working at Woolworths, I became familiar with the virtues of the trade union movement. And that certainly set me on a path to be interested in how we are governed as a society and the role that lawmakers play that can be really positive. And that definitely gave me a taste for political advocacy and the ability to make a difference. And anybody that's been involved in something like this and gets a taste of changing a law or even passing a law or making a decision that helps other people, it's exceptionally rewarding. Exceptionally rewarding. No different to a volunteer who helps someone. The sense of satisfaction they get from that is a really healthy but also addictive thing. And for me, I started to really experience that in my 20s. That gave me a sense that, notwithstanding its flaws, like I said, politics can be a positive thing if used wisely.
Mentioned earlier, you first went into the parliament in the upper house.
Yeah.
Why weren't you in the lower house then?
I got Jay Weatherill was the former premier of the state, and a vacancy came in the upper house, and he called me up and said, I want you to think about filling it. And I told him, no way, Jose.
No way, Jay.
No way, Jay. And I remember the call really well, and because I had other plans. And he said, we'll have a coffee with me, at least talk about it. And I did. And he's an exceptionally persuasive human being. And I'm very grateful to him for it, because it ultimately put me on a trajectory to move to the lower house at the following election, which I did. I was in the upper house for a couple of years, got into the lower house, which is where all the action is, I think, with all due respect to my upper house colleagues. And I've been very grateful for that because
you've had a number of ministerial portfolios. I imagine nothing in the political contest sense can beat being the premier, but what have been some of the notable things that you've really enjoyed?
I loved corrections. We did a bunch of reforms to reduce recidivism. Corrections is an area, and I think in most state governments, that goes sight unseen. Yep, exactly. But I really enjoyed it because I saw an opportunity to sort of take that sort of a sense of wanting to use the power of Parliament to inform social justice outcomes through the corrections portfolio, and we did a lot in that reform, and now South Australia has the lowest recidivism rate or reoffending rate in the nation, when we certainly did not when we embarked on that effort. And I really enjoyed that opportunity. People tend not to sit around at night, though, thinking about reoffending, but it's actually pretty important if you can get it right.
A tough word, recidivism, but
yes.
Peter Malinauskas, thank you very much for joining me today on the Centre for Public Integrity's podcast.
I appreciate the opportunity, and we should be proud of what we've got here in Australia in terms of our democracy. I guess our obligation is to try and make it just that little bit better where we can.
True. Thank you very much.
Cheers.